You're listening to the Otis Jiry channel.
Chapter 1. Arrival. One cold, rainy, blustery November night, a lone figure stood illuminated by a single light from beyond the large, ornate abbey gates. The sound of the taxi receded into the night as he put down his heavy bag with a sigh, pleased to at last have arrived at his destination. Grimsfell Abbey stood imposingly high above the bleak coastline, overlooking the little village tucked in amongst a few leaning windswept trees. The hills behind the abbey gave way to the ever-increasing slope of scrubland up to the vast limestone mountain that dominated the landscape. He could feel the presence of the mountain, even though he could not see it, as he blinked in the direction of the little light directing him to the entrance. After moving the heavy iron gate just enough to squeeze through, Professor Benson made his way up the weed-infested, crunching gravel path towards the light above a small doorway partially hidden by stunted cypress trees. He wiped away the drops of rain from his face and tugged the cast-iron bell-pull handle, which responded with a faint tinkle from behind the oak door. After a while, the door creaked, and it creaked open to reveal a small man in a monk's habit staring up at him. It was the middle of the night, and the professor immediately apologized for arriving at such a late hour, explaining how he was held up at the nearest town, trying to find a taxi that would take him this far into the rain-lashed night. The diminutive monk said he was expected and that a room had been made ready for him. That was exactly what the professor needed, a good rest. Hot tea and biscuits were rustled up for him, and the little monk bade him good night and said he would inform the abbot of his arrival in the morning. It was late morning by the time the professor was awakened by a knock on his door. "Hello there. I'm sorry to wake you, but just to pass on a message from Abbot Gregory," came the little monk's voice. "He will see you at 2:30 in his study." "Okay, thanks." "Would you like some breakfast, toast, and tea?" "That would be wonderful," replied the professor. "I'll be down soon." Professor Benson was no stranger to investigating unexplained occurrences and the people involved, especially events of a paranormal nature. He was a tall, middle-aged man, softly spoken, who dressed conservatively in a suit and waistcoat set off by a bow tie. The day was in stark contrast to the night before, with the sun threatening its way through the thinning cloud. The wind and rain had all but ceased, and some birds were pleasantly singing. The professor paused by his window to admire the view on his way out to the passageway to find the bathroom. His window faced the sloping landscape down to the cliffs and the sea, with the little village of Grimsfell nestled in a hollow to his right, between the abbey and the cliff tops. After successfully navigating the passages beyond his room, he discovered a quaint, white-tiled bathroom with the yellowing white enameled iron bath supported on clawed feet, complete with a set of large, industrial-looking brass taps. The ancient cast-iron cistern above his head whistled with leaking water pressure with that irritating sound which is only eliminated for a brief time by activating the clanking mechanism. A first-time flush achieved by trial and error and deft manipulation of the chain pull. Cream-colored bath and hand towels were neatly displayed upon matching brass rails beside the robust rectangular hand basin, together with a new bar of coal tar soap, flannel, and a floral porcelain tooth mug seated in a wall-mounted brass ring. After a much-anticipated wash, he found his way back along the passages to his room, only to be surprised on turning the corner to be confronted by an agitated, chanting monk clasping and unclasping his hands in rhythmic fashion. "I'm sorry, I nearly bumped into you there," apologized the professor, but the monk seemed oblivious to his presence and shuffled on past him, down the corridor in the direction of the bathroom. Something was troubling him. After his late breakfast in a small room next to the dining hall, the professor lay on his bed, acclimatizing himself to the new surroundings, and at the appointed time was downstairs in the oak-paneled hallway, and began to admire the paintings on the wall panels, except admire wasn't really the word to use. They were disturbing paintings with a distinct theme to them: fear, persecution, suffering, pain and death. His deep concentration of the detail of the paintings was broken by the sudden voice of a man standing at the far end of the hallway. "Professor Benson, so good of you to come and see us. I hope you had a good night after your arrival in all that wind and rain. I'm afraid the weather up here can be quite intense at times." "Well, it certainly was last night, but I had a very welcome rest, thank you," responded the professor, walking towards him. "I understand from your letter that you have an urgent need for some advice and guidance concerning some of your monk's strange behavior, Abbot." "Indeed. Please come along to my study and I'll attempt to explain the situation," said the abbot, gesticulating in the direction of his room. To one side of the hallway stood a magnificent potted aspidistra plant, displayed on an ornate, elevated plinth, the whole structure standing taller than its frequent admirers. Once inside, the abbot closed the door behind them and walked across the large oaken study. "Please, would you excuse me for a moment?" the abbot asked without looking up, as he opened a small door to another room, pausing to place a hand on his forehead. "Of course, I'll have a look around your splendid room, if I may." Quite a long time passed, and the professor was concerned, moving to outside the closed door. "Excuse me, Abbot, but are you all right in there?" Receiving no reply, he waited for a while before partially opening the door to call again. "Hello? Are you okay?" Professor Benson put his head around the door to see the abbot sitting on a chair in the small room. He was quietly sobbing. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I was worried you might not have been feeling well," he explained. The abbot looked embarrassed. "You could say that," he said. "I haven't been able to sleep much at all lately. I'm sorry to have lost my composure like this, but I'm so glad you've arrived here to try and help us." "You must tell me what on earth is going on here. Can I get you something? A drink, perhaps?" No, I'll be fine once I've explained the troubles here." The professor went back into the study and sat on one of the richly upholstered carved chairs. The abbot emerged after a minute or so to sit at his desk, his hands shaking, clasped over his face in apparent despair, eventually looking up at the professor. "I took up the position here 8 years ago, and at first all was well, and I was very much looking forward to the challenges of my new job here at the Abbey. At the beginning of the next new year, I became aware that some of my brother monks were displaying rather odd behavior." "Odd behavior?" repeated the professor. "Well, I didn't think much of it at first, but I became increasingly aware that a few of the brothers I had come to know quite well seemed offish and kind of detached. Later, 2 of them barely spoke to me and spent long hours in their rooms instead of attending to their duties. I eventually had to call them to my office to inquire about their problems. It was then I knew something was terribly wrong. Brother Gilbert was the first. He sat in the chair you are now sitting in, with what I can only describe as a grimace upon his face, a kind of smug, self-satisfied, distorted grin. When I began to question him, he wouldn't look directly at me, and what followed shocked me greatly. He began chanting blasphemy, using strange hand gestures to emphasize his words. All I can say is that it was pure evil to watch him. It mattered not what I said. He remained in this bizarre animate state, only to end when I asked him to leave and seek advice from our physician. He left the room without a word, leaving the door wide open. He was obviously having some mental problem. What happened after that? He disappeared from the Abbey. Despite many hours searching, I eventually contacted the police in the town, and they conducted a missing persons search, but to no avail. He simply seemed to vanish. He wasn't the only one. While all this was going on, another brother asked to see me, and we began to talk. At first he said he was having trouble sleeping, and was experiencing disturbing nightmares, which he explained were difficult to tell from reality. He would wake suddenly in terrible fear and be unable to quickly realize it was a bad dream. He told me he was embarrassed to tell anyone, although he recalls some of the other brothers had heard him muttering and shouting in his sleep most nights. I obviously inquired as to the nature of his dreams and nightmares. It was quite a shock, I can tell you, Professor. The professor shifted in his chair and poured out some water from the jug on the desk. The brother explained to me how his dreams were antagonistic to his beliefs, and that, however hard he tried, he could not disregard certain regular unwanted images and words that came to him. The problem didn't improve, and he would be missing for several days at a time. No one knew where he was or had been. How long did this go on for? Nearly a year, and then he disappeared at the end of September, just like Brother Gilbert. How many others have been affected? 3 more I'm aware of. What do you think is happening, Professor? Well, it sounds to me something similar to schizophrenia, but more than that. Do you believe in demonic possession, Professor? Well, frankly, no, but I have seen similar cases which I have no explanation for. Are your thoughts about possession based on your religious beliefs, Abbot? Only in that it is a necessary fact. Because we believe in a benevolent God and angels, there also has to exist a malevolent devil and demons, those who give prayers for good and those who give curses for evil. I would agree with you, Abbot, but then I'm afraid we'd be both wrong because your logic is flawed, being based on a false premise. Well, I believe in what I trust to be true. Of course you do, and so do I. But don't forget, it was you who called me in to help with the problem, and I'm a psychiatrist who deals with facts and truth based on evidence, not fiction and fantasy born of delusion. You knew that. Touché, Professor. I would consider a mental disorder to be the likely cause, something driven by anxiety. Do you think that the affected brothers may be obsessively doubting their beliefs, driven by their inner quest for truth, and compulsively sabotaging them with blasphemy? I really can't say, Professor. I'll just have to leave that in your very capable hands and be available to help when I can. How many are affected at this moment? Mercifully, only one. Brother Edward. He has become violent and evasive, especially when anyone tries to question him about it. Would I be able to speak with him? I can only try to get him to come along and meet you, perhaps by using some other reason for you to see him, and then you could see how far you can get in the interview, suggested the abbot. That's a good idea. I must give it some thought tonight. Brother Edward has entered the phase of going missing for a day or two. Last Wednesday and Thursday he didn't appear for prayers or for duties. He simply seemed to vanish like the others. Well, hopefully I'll come up with something tomorrow. He stood up and made for the study door, turning on his heel. May I explore the Abbey grounds? I think it may help to inspire me. Of course, Professor. Feel free. Behind the Abbey you will find the kitchen garden, cemetery, and mausoleum, where our brothers are interred during the centuries long ago. It's a bit desolate and windswept back there, as it has always been. It's part of the character of the place, I suppose," he added. Professor Benson thanked the abbot and went back to his room to reflect on his task ahead.